This story starts back in 1998, in a somewhat unusual place. Unglued, that wacky hotbed of creative and goofy cards. This was the first joke set, and it was full of silly designs that pushed the boundaries of normal Magic. One of them was, or should I say two of them were, BFM, Big Furry Monster, a gigantic black creature with a whopping power and toughness of 99.99. This was far and away the biggest creature in the game, so big in fact that it stretched across two separate cards. A player had to have both halves in their hand at the same time in order to cast them together. As a testament to its sheer scale, the BFM even has other magic creatures hanging from its horns as jewelry, Polar Kraken on the left, and Phyrexian Dreadnought on the right. This quirky design went down well. BFM was the most popular card from Unglued. This spurred Magic designer Mark Rosewater to get even more creative. If players like having one spell across two cards, he thought, then maybe they would enjoy seeing two spells on a single card. He was inspired to pursue this concept in Unglued 2. However, Unglued 2 was cancelled, and Rosewater's idea was put on ice. Its time would come again 2 years later, during the development of the set Invasion. This was a set with a multicolor theme, focusing on the allied color pairs. Rosewater liked the idea of having different colored spells on a single card, thinking it would play well into Invasion's mechanics, so he pitched a cycle of 2-in-1 split cards. But Mike Elliott, one of the other designers, was against the split cards. He considered them too much of a radical break with convention. At the time, Magic had used the same card frame in every set since Alpha, so the split cards would be the first to buck tradition and feature a new frame of their own. At first, most of the Wizards team leaned more toward Mike's point of view, until they actually played with the split cards in playtesting, and found them to be incredibly fun. A lot of this is due to the cards' flexibility. Cards that offer multiple options for different situations tend to be much better than they look, even if their individual effects appear overpriced. Modal cards are more than the sum of their parts, because they let you include narrow effects at little deck building cost. The split cards weren't the first Magic cards to offer players this kind of choice. The original modal spell was actually released in Alpha, in the form of Healing Solve. It was the white entry in the boon cycle, including Lightning Bolt and Dark Ritual. It was by far the weakest of the 5, which is why Richard Garfield gave it the choice of gaining life or preventing damage. Many cards would follow in this vein, most notably the first cycle of Charms, released in Mirage. The Invasion split cards were essentially a more fleshed out and flavorful iteration of this idea, offering not just multiple effects, but multiple mana costs, multiple names, and even multiple artwork. Invasion served up 5 split cards, all of which were instants or sorceries. All of their names were taken from 3-word phrases using the word and, i.e. wax and wane, pain and suffering, assault and battery, and so on. These cards featured classic effects associated with each color. For example, the green wax buffs a creature, while the white wane destroys an enchantment. Then there's the very elegant Spite and Malice, where Spite is a blue instant that counters a non-creature spell, and Malice is a black one that destroys a non-black creature. The third set in the block, Apocalypse, added a cycle of enemy color split cards, which also tended to feature effects that complemented or contrasted with one another creatively. For example, with Order and Chaos, the white half exiles an attacking creature, while the red one prevents all creatures from blocking this turn. The best of them is the blue-red one, Fire and Ice, which saw considerable standard play and continues to show up in modern decks. Fire and Ice is a strong split card because it's never a dead draw. Thanks to Ice, you can always cycle it for a card. spending 2 mana to tap a permanent and draw a card isn't a bad fallback option, especially since the alternative lets you deal 2 damage either to an opponent or to take out small creatures. When fire manages to kill 1 or even 2 creatures, the card becomes a formidable play. Before we continue with these split cards, we need to take a slight detour with Champions of Kamigawa. Kamigawa was one of the earliest instances of a top-down approach to block design, where narrative and world building shaped the mechanics of the cards rather than the other way around. One of the stories the designers wanted to depict on cards was that of characters changing, especially people starting out as anonymous rookies but becoming heroes over time, mastering certain powers and gaining fame. This led to the development of a new way of combining 2 cards in one. While the invasion split cards required players to choose between casting one half or the other, Kamigawa's flip cards could transform between their 2 forms. Every set within the Kamigawa block included these flip cards, which entered the battlefield in their initial creature form, complete with a mana cost, power and toughness stats, and other attributes. Once specific conditions were met, the card was physically rotated 180 degrees, activating its alternate identity. In Champions of Kamigawa, the flip cards came in a cycle of so-called heroes, all of which began as non-legendary creatures that change into their legendary forms. An example is Budoka Gardener, a creature with a ramp effect that flips when you have 10 or more lands, becoming Dokai, Weaver of Life. Betrayers of Kamigawa featured a cycle of human creatures that flipped into legendary spirits, like Faithful Squire, which becomes Kaiso, Memory of Loyalty. Finally, Saviors of Kamigawa had a cycle of monks that flipped into enchantments, including Homura, Human Ascendant, who changes into Homura's essence, an enchantment that essentially turns all your creatures into dragons. The strongest of them is Ereo, Soratami Ascendant, a 2-mana blue creature that says, whenever the 4th spell is cast in a turn, flip it, turning into Ereo's essence, which reads, whenever an opponent casts their first spell each turn, counter that spell. Although flip cards were a creative concept, they proved to be problematic. The art box was overly busy, and they were difficult to manage on the battlefield. Determining which half of the card was active became confusing, particularly when the creature was tapped or in a crowded play area. Another major limitation of flip cards was the restricted space available for text, as both halves had to share the same physical card. This not only curtailed the complexity of their abilities, but also left no room for flavor text, a significant drawback for a lore-rich set like Kamigawa. Wizards R&D ultimately considered the flip cards a failure, meaning that we're unlikely to ever see them again. Nevertheless, they did tap into some fertile design space. We'll return to this later, but for now, back to split cards. Invasion-style split cards would show up again a few years later in another multicolor-focused block, Ravnica. Dissension included a cycle of split cards where both halves were multicolor spells that overlapped in one color. My favorite is Pure and Simple. Pure is a Gruul sorcery that destroys target multicolor permanent, while Simple is a Selesnya sorcery that destroys all equipment and auras. Both cards depict their respective guilds' desire to strip back artifice and return to nature. Next came Planar Chaos, the middle set in Time Spiral block, which was all about alternate realities. It gave us a vertical cycle of mono-red split cards, meaning one that stretched across rarities: Dead and Gone, Rough and Tumble, and Boom and Bust. Boom and Bust is a pretty neat design, with each half representing a variation on the same idea, but at a different scale. Boom is a 2-mana sorcery that says, destroy target land you control and target land you don't control, while Bust is a 6-mana sorcery reading destroy all lands. By the way, if you target one of your own fetch lands with Boom, and sack the fetch land in response, Boom will still blow up your opponent's land, but not yours. The next innovation for split cards came with Dragon's Maze, which introduced a new mechanic called Fuse. Fuse allowed you to cast both sides of the split card at once. The emblematic example is Wear and Tear, which is shatter and demystify on a single card. It sees a decent amount of play because it handles two troublesome card types while occupying just a single sideboard slot. With its Fuse ability, it even has the potential to be a 2-for-1. This is an incredibly elegant and efficient design. The next variation of split cards arrived in Amonkhet, a set with an Egyptian flavor and a graveyard focus. This was the Aftermath mechanic, which allows players to cast the bottom half only from the graveyard. This effect essentially combined split cards with flashback. To differentiate these cards visually, they received a unique frame. While the top half appears like a standard spell you'd cast from your hand, the bottom half adopts the traditional split card layout. The Aftermath cards also built on the naming convention established by the Invasion split cards. Rather than having two words connected by the word "and", the Aftermath card names are connected by the word "to", like Rags to Riches, Spring to Mind, and Cut to Ribbons. The tweak here was that you didn't have the option of casting both cards from your hand, but to compensate, you gained the additional value of being able to cast the other half later from the graveyard. For this reason, most of the Amonkhet Aftermath cards have effects that synergize with one another, especially if you happen to cast both halves of the card on the same turn in the late game. For example, Claim lets you return a creature with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, after which, if you have the mana, you can cast Fame from your graveyard, giving the creature you returned +2/+0 and haste. Similarly, Insult says damage can't be prevented this turn. If a source you control would deal damage this turn, it deals double that damage instead, combining nicely with the other half Injury, which deals 2 damage to target creature and 2 damage to target player, allowing you to deal an unpreventable 4 damage to both targets if you cast these spells in sequence. The Aftermath design is a solid attempt, but was mostly received negatively by the player base, in part because these cards were underpowered. By this point, split cards had become fairly closely associated with Ravnica, which is why they were brought back yet again in 2018's Guilds of Ravnica and its follow-up, Ravnica Allegiance. These were split cards where one card was a hybrid 2-color spell and the other was a non-hybrid 2-color spell, both of them from the same guild. The hybrid spell tended to be cheaper than the non-hybrid one. One difference with this cycle was that they abandoned the naming convention involving the word "and". Instead, each half of the card had a name beginning with the same 3 letters, like Warrant/Warden and Collision/Colossus. This is much less effective and less interesting than the old approach. The next major mechanics inspired by split cards arrived in the form of adventures in Throne of Eldraine, and later the modal double-faced cards in Zendikar Rising. All of these designs are essentially more elaborate takes on split cards. Adventures contained 2 spells and placed one of them in exile, where it remained castable. MDFCs, on the other hand, utilized the front and back of a card, rather than squeezing 2 spells onto a single side. In this regard, the MDFCs built on the transforming double-faced cards debuted in Innistrad, which in turn were expanded versions of the flip cards from Kamigawa. Both of these designs could take up entire videos, so I'm not going to explore them in depth here. Suffice it to say, they wouldn't exist without the path blazed by the original split cards. Modern Horizons 2 then gave us 2 new traditional split cards, and 1 new Aftermath card. The latter is a fairly cool and synergistic one called Road to Ruin. Road is a 3-mana rampant growth, while Ruin is a red sorcery that deals damage to target creature equal to the number of lands you control. In 2024, on the 4th visit to Ravnica, in Murders at Karlov Manor, players received yet another cycle of split cards. Both halves of these cards were hybrid spells. The left side was a cheaper instant, and the right side was a more expensive sorcery. The two cards each had a different color combination but overlapped on a color, using a wedge combination of colors. Plus, the old "and" naming convention fortunately came back, making them feel more like the classic split cards. An example is Hustle and Bustle. Hustle is an Izzet spell that says, target creature attacks or blocks this turn if able, showcasing the guild's magical tricksiness. And Bustle is a Gruul spell with creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain trample until end of turn. You may turn a creature you control face up, emphasizing the clan's focus on creatures and raw combat power. While not splashy or exciting, these cards are simply and cleanly designed. They work because they show off the Ravnica of old, rather than the set's detective gimmick. The most recent reinterpretation of split cards are the rooms from Dusk Mourn. The plane of Dusk Mourn is a sprawling haunted house that shifts and morphs like a living entity, striving to wring as much fear as possible from its victims. Consequently, much of the design process revolved around how best to represent the concept of a room. R&D wanted these rooms to do more than just signify a place. They needed to set a mood, influence gameplay, and provide ongoing effects. Their finished design took the form of split cards featuring two distinct rooms on a single card. However, unlike traditional split cards, these are permanents that remain on the battlefield after being cast. Players can initially choose which room to unlock upon casting the card, and the second room can be activated later by paying its mana cost. Just like most traditional split cards, both halves of a room share a thematic or mechanical connection. A case in point is Charred Foyer/Warped Space. The cheaper room Charred Foyer allows you to exile a card each turn. Then the higher cost Warp Space lets you cast exiled cards for free, including those from Charred Foyer. This design philosophy is present in almost all of the rooms, where the left side door, typically the cheaper half, helps fuel the right side door, which tends to be more powerful but also more expensive. These rooms come with a ton of quirks and interesting interactions. For instance, if a room enters the battlefield without being cast, like say being flickered, then both doors remain locked, and neither ability will be active. Unlocking a door is a special action that does not use the stack and cannot be responded to. While a room is on the battlefield, its mana value corresponds to the total cost of its unlocked doors. For instance, if only Charred Foyer is active, the room's mana value is 4. If Warped Space is unlocked, the total mana value becomes 10. As a whole, Dusk Mourn was a mixed bag flavor-wise, with some delightfully spooky cards alongside others that felt more like shallow references. The rooms are one of the set's better flavor creations. They have a real creepiness to them, tapping into that classic horror trope of exploring different parts of a haunted house, bracing for what might lie in the shadows. Unholy Annex depicts the gathering place of cultists, while Ritual Chamber creates a 6/6 demon token, representing the horror they have summoned. I also like the immersive simplicity of Greenhouse and Rickety Gazebo, conveying the feel of urban exploration, like you're wandering through an abandoned manor. The most impressive feat of the room mechanic is how intuitive and seamless it feels, despite introducing an entirely new way for permanents to function in Magic. The design team managed to keep the mechanic elegant and easy to grasp, while still pushing the boundaries of what the game can do. Even the original split cards are fairly complex rules-wise, even if they don't necessarily look it, and they haven't always functioned as they do now. They received a big rules update in April 2017, which is still in force today. Originally, split cards had 3 possible mana values when determining their cost, each half individually and the total combined cost. This led to unintended interactions, such as using Isochron Scepter or 3 mana cascade spells to cast Bound from Bound and Determined, even though Bound's mana value was 5. Another example of this loophole was the expertise cycle in Aether Revolt, which allowed players to cast split cards in ways that provided more value than intended. To address this, Amonkhet introduced a rules change that simplified how split card mana values are determined. Now, a split card's mana value is always the total of both halves, except when it is on the stack, while on the stack, only the half that was cast determines its color and mana value. A split card has 2 faces and 2 distinct names, but is still a single card, while on the stack, only the characteristics of the cast half are relevant. The other half is ignored until it enters another zone. If an effect causes you to discard a card, a split card counts as a single card, not 2 separate ones. Similarly, if a spell or ability checks the number of sorcery cards in your graveyard, Assault and Battery counts as just 1 sorcery. These adjustments ensure that split cards remain balanced, while preserving their versatility and strategic depth. Looking at Magic's history, it's fascinating to see how 2-in-1 mechanics have become much more frequent over time. The first iteration appeared 7 years after the game's creation, yet they have snowballed in recent years. Many factors account for this. Over the last decade, Wizards of the Coast has become more proactive in using unique frame treatments as a design tool. Mike Elliott balked at the split card frame in 2000, but now we seem to get multiple new frame variants every year. Plus, players love split cards, and 2-in-1 designs in general, and for good reason. They're cool and often powerful, even if occasionally problematic. Perhaps the most important thing about split cards is the choices they present to players. Choice is the backbone of Magic. Every decision made during a game presents an opportunity to outmaneuver the opponent, and over time, the player who consistently makes the best choices will win more often. This is why professional players frequently gravitate toward control decks, and why John Finkel is known for playing Storm. These archetypes offer numerous decision points, allowing skilled players to leverage their expertise to gain an edge. Additionally, Magic is a game with inherent variance, meaning that randomness plays a role in every match. By using cards that maximize flexibility and provide multiple lines of play, players can mitigate this randomness, taking control of their fate rather than leaving it entirely to chance. Finally, choices scale with skill. The more agency a card hands to a player, the more the impact of that card will depend on how good that player is. For all these reasons, the original Invasion split cards rank among the most influential designs in the game. They inspired many offshoots, from flip cards to Aftermath, and most significantly of all, double-faced cards, which continue to grow in number and prominence. 2-in-1 mechanics offer plenty of room for further innovation, making them a design space likely to be explored for years to come. As Mark Rosewater has said, I think split cards tap into something much deeper. Magic cards are essentially a canvas that the game designers get to illustrate. There's something potent about the idea that your card is more than just one card, that it's capable of being something grander. Until next time, thanks for watching.